Thank you very much for that warm welcome. Before I begin, I'd really like to extend my thanks, first of all, to all of you here at Gordon Administration, faculty, and staff for having me this year. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. And my sincere thanks to Dr. Alter for really giving me a warm and hospitable welcome upon arriving here, and to his staff for doing so much work to organize this, and to Dr. Evelyn Harper as well for opening her classroom to me a couple of times today, and her students for also warmly welcoming me. It really is nice to be back here on Christian College campus. Although I didn't study at Gordon, I've had lots of friends and colleagues who have been in and out of here over the years, and it really is nice to be back into this sense of community. DC is kind of a fun and exciting place to be, but it's not always the warmest of places. People tend to be kind of very busy and very focused on what particular bit of analysis or policy they're working on, and so it's nice to have even just a day and a half here to settle in and engage in your community. And I really do appreciate that. I should mention one other quick thing which hasn't been highlighted in my biographical materials, but I'm going to throw in a plug anyway. When I was an undergrad at Messiah College, one of my most formative experiences, certainly that's kind of brought me to the point that I'm at the moment, is doing study abroad. I was an undergrad and was part of one of the first semesters of the Middle East Studies program of the CCCU. And for those of you who are students and not quite ready to graduate yet, you can still go on that program. And it was really a life-changing experience for me. And I should also respond as well. I need to defend myself here. I didn't meet my wife when I was doing my Fulbright, so I wasn't squandering your tax-paying resources on dating. I did meet her when I was a few years previous when I was doing humanitarian work in Egypt, so I'm off the hook on that one, I think. Well, let me say a couple of brief comments before getting directly into my topic for today regarding the current era of uprisings in the Arab world. My background, after my study abroad program, at least in the Middle East, my background has been not just kind of scholarly and academic, but very quite personal in the Middle East. And I've had opportunities to do research, but I've also had opportunities to live and work and commune with others, fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, and also Muslim neighbors and colleagues and friends in Egypt and other parts of the Arab world. And so it's very important that I emphasize, and I do try to emphasize in my work, in my writings, in my scholarship, and even in my current policy work, the very human reality of the Middle East. It's very important to me that my audience understands that I'm not talking about a sort of monolithic two-dimensional place, somehow distant and somehow other from our own experience as individuals and communities here in the West, but real living, breathing societies full of regular, everyday people. And that human perspective is a pretty crucial one, especially for the sorts of things that we're talking about here today. Is my mic not coming through? Can everyone hear me okay in the meantime? Okay, good acoustics, I like it. Well, my question, of course, for this afternoon, Arab Spring or Islamist Winter? Let me keep you in suspense for a moment. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of these trends. And when we use these terms like Arab Spring or Islamist Winter, of course I'm not creating these terms. These are terms that over the course of the last, well, what's now a little more than a year, we've seen these terms sort of bandied about in the press, and frankly among the policy community as well. And so I want to break down these terms a little bit and help us understand a little bit about where these terms are coming from, and perhaps try to gain some understanding of what they might mean and what they may mean in the years going forward. So Arab Spring, let's start with this expression, the most commonly used term referring to this season of uprisings in the Arab world. It's not entirely clear who first referred to this series of socio-political revolts in the Arab world as the Arab Spring, although my money is on George Washington University's Mark Lynch often known by his blogging avatar of Abu Aardvark. But the term stuck, at least for a while. And it did seem entirely appropriate in those early, heady, exuberant days of 2011, of January and February, March of last year. Tunisians at that point had pushed their president Ben Ali from office in a matter of weeks, provoked to action by the self-immolation of a young fruit vendor who was driven to absolute desperation by the indignities of his regime's corruption. Egyptians, meanwhile, had taken to Tahrir Square in a rather remarkable and remarkably peaceful 18 days of protests that forced out their own aging dictator, Hosni Mubarak. And it really was an amazing achievement. Revolutionaries refused to take up arms, despite the brutality of the regime. Neighborhoods formed local security committees to protect themselves, their homes, and their businesses as police were removed from the streets. And Muslims and Christians very visibly cooperated in a rare period of solidarity and mutual recognition there in the square. Meanwhile, just to the west in Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, who was never particularly concerned with his global image, at least as far as it extended beyond his keen sense of fashion, he so brutally repressed the initial early local protests that its revolutionaries armed themselves not with smartphones, but instead with Kalashnikovs and any other well-worn old bits of small arms that they could get their hands on. And that rebellion lasted nearly until the end of the year, eventually, of course, supported by NATO air support. And before that uprising eventually culminated in Gaddafi's brutal and bloody end, beaten to death by rebel soldiers near his hometown of Sirte. To the north in Syria, an initially peaceful uprising began when a group of teenage taggers in Deraa, a rather sleepy border village just a stone's throw away from Jordan to the south, were arrested and tortured simply for spray painting political messages of warning to the doctor, which of course is a reference to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, who was in fact a UK-trained ophthalmologist before he became a dictator, after the death of his father, Hafez al-Assad, in 2000. Other protests began erupting around the country in response, and the regime just as quickly sent out its army to quell those protests. A year of violence has followed. Those protests have morphed into, well, more protests, but also into the development of what's come to be known as the Free Syrian Army, essentially a ragtag series of militias comprised of military defectors from the Syrian army. And that issue is still... Well, that gives us a sense, perhaps, of this question of the Arab Spring. And now we can turn to this other term, of course, that we sometimes hear journalists and analysts have begun to use, perhaps since the fall, and that's the Islamist Winter. This is, of course, the latter narrative, the one that emerged in the fall of last year as the change of season and of the short attention span of lots of journalists and analysts, myself included, meant that the whole spring framework was getting rather long in the tooth. Conveniently, in each of the Arab countries that I just mentioned, which had, at least those which had successfully overthrown their regimes, excluding the ones still in progress, those places appeared to have handed a new political mandate to their respective Islamists. In Tunisia, the Islamist Ennahda, or Renaissance Party, won a little more than 40% of the seats in the new parliament, giving them the largest parliamentary bloc and the prime minister's seat. In far second place was a leftist party with a mere 14% of the vote, who was going to be dominating, if not quite running, all of Tunisia's politics. In Egypt, elections between November and January ended with the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party taking around 47% of Egypt's new post-revolutionary parliament, and far more concerning to many of us, the rather hardline, ultra-conservative Salafi party, known as the Noor Party, or the Party of Light, came in second with roughly 24% of the new Egyptian parliament. Meanwhile, the more left-leaning parties, such as the old Waft Party and the Liberal Bloc, each took in only Massive, massive victory for Egypt. In Libya, of course, there haven't been any elections yet, but while I'm not overly morbid, but as Gaddafi's blood was still on the ground, the Libyan Transitional Council's assumption of leadership came almost immediately, and its chair, Mustafa Abdel Jalil, announced within days a series of Islamist-leaning policies for the country, including the reinstitution of polygamy, the introduction of what's known as the Islamic banking system, and a commitment to institute some form, rather vague terms, of Sharia law that is a traditional in the new Libya. Syria, well, this is a big question mark. In a sense, Syria, along with Egypt, over the course of the last centuries, has really been at the heart of many trends in the region's political and cultural dynamics. And there, the uprising was not sparked by Islamists, but they do have a presence. Syrian Muslim Brotherhood members, for example, comprise a little over half of the Syrian National Council, the most prominent opposition organization. There are Islamist fighters among the pockets of the Free Syrian Army operating in and around Syria and along its borders with Turkey and Lebanon. And there are signs, troubling signs to be sure, that there is an increasing presence of some more radical Islamists working to gain a foothold in the revolution. They have not gained that foothold so far, and by all signs they haven't gained much of a presence yet, but they are trying. As more blood is shed in the Syrian revolution, as Assad's regime continues to indiscriminately shell towns, seize and torture children, and repress its population, the potential remains for the uprising to be further radicalized. Brings us to a broader question that I want to spend the next few minutes talking about. Why is it that Islamists have taken the upper hand following this series of revolutions in the region? What do they want? Well, over the course of the last year, there have been a number of people in the press, the analyst community, scholars who have somehow been perplexed at the ascendance of Islamists into this new position of political ascendancy in the Arab world. The reality is that for decades, much policy formulation on the Middle East, and to be certain, a lot of scholarly writing on the region, has focused on the remarkable resilience of the authoritarian order, almost universally throughout the region, with the exception perhaps of Little Lebanon, which has its own unique set of problems too. In other words, people have rested on the assumption that because authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, if you want to think of it that way, have tended to rule the Arab world for the last half century and more, that they would continue to do so, that they would maintain that sort of authoritarian stability for in perpetuity. Well, the problem, of course, is that politicians and scholars alike rested on the assumption of status quo, that because these Arab autocracies had long been the way of things in the Middle East, that they would always remain so. But the truth is that status quo is always a long-term falsehood. Nothing ever stays the same, not really. And for anyone closely observing the Arab world over the last quarter century, even as authoritarian pseudo-secular regimes decayed from within and increasingly alienated their own populations, the handwriting was written on the wall in bold underlined letters for anyone willing to read them. Those letters said that people were tired and they were angry, despondent of life under the brutality of their corrupt regimes, of their increasingly hollow ideologies, and people were looking for alternatives. Many Arab Muslims over the last 30 years began increasingly to find their socio-political voice in the spectrum of Islamic conservatism. And I do want to express that as a spectrum. There is no one Islamist ideology. And increasingly finding their sense of political belonging in a kind of fusion of Islamism and nationalism. About 12 years ago, Genevieve Abdu published a book called No God But God, Egypt and the Triumph of Islam, what I would call a brilliant and nearly prophetic book about the rise of Islamic conservatism in Egypt. Not necessarily radicalism, although on occasion it does take that form. She opened the book with a rather vivid description that I'd like to read to you just a little portion of Friday prayers taking place in a central residential district, a rather upscale one in Cairo. So let me read this little excerpt from you, and then I'll explain to you why it is that this particular excerpt has some meaning for me. She begins the book this way. Mind you, this was written 11 years before the Arab revolts brought Islamist parties to a new sense of political strength. The scene from my balcony in one of Cairo's wealthiest districts offered a view the world had somehow failed to notice. Each Friday, within minutes of the awe-inspiring refrain of Allahu Akbar, God is great, dozens of men flocked to a small plaza below, each clinging to a green prayer mat. They laid them out in unison, turning a small triangle in the street into a sea of green, the color of the Prophet Muhammad. They removed their shoes and prostrated themselves toward the mosque, and far beyond, toward Mecca itself. I was intrigued not by the sound of the muezzin, whose eloquent echo can be heard in various keys across most Muslim cities 5 times a day, nor by the instant field of green, which I soon learned was commonplace wherever Cairo's faithful gathered to pray. Rather, I was struck by the fact that the worshippers, hunched over their mats, were not the kind of men commonly seen in the streets and coffee houses of Cairo. One glance revealed their social class. The smooth feet of this well-groomed set stood in sharp contrast to the rough calluses many Egyptian men developed from dragging their bare heels over the edges of their ill-fitting shoes. I was stunned that middle and upper middle class men would leave their luxurious apartments and villas in Zamalek, once home to Egypt's pashas and kings, to pray on a dusty corner of Ahmed Hishmet Street. Nearly everything I had read before coming to Egypt in 1993 described the Islamic Revival as a movement reserved for the poor. The common explanation in press accounts in academic circles for Egypt's return to its Islamic identity had become a cliché. After experimenting with socialism, Arab nationalism, and capitalism under successive leaders, a vast majority of Egyptians were left poverty-stricken and embittered toward the West. But as I watched the men dressed in imitation Pierre Cardin sweaters and fine starched cotton shirts sprawled out along the green mats in the street, that theory rang false. In the months that followed, I met wealthy women from Doi, another upper-crust district, who followed the teachings of a conservative sheikh, known for bringing wayward actresses and wives of government ministers back into the Islamic fold. After attending his religious lessons and listening to his Friday sermons at the local mosque, women who were once slaves to fashion took the veil and gave their expensive French wine to the secular friends they left behind. Instead of preparing lunch for their husbands in the mid-afternoon when the workday ends, they fasted and prayed, provoking tensions within their families. That overwhelming Islamic sentiment on display begged an obvious question. What effect, beyond the symbols of veils and prayer mats, was the Islamic Revival having on the spirit and values of ordinary people? The reason I read this quote, in part because Abdu knew what she was talking about 12 years ago, and we shouldn't have been surprised to know that that same brand of Islamic conservatism that has been giving many people in Egypt and other parts of the Arab world a sense of, yes, hope and a sense of meaning in the midst of their corrupt governance. I also read it to you because in my earliest experiences living in Egypt as a student in the Middle East Studies program, later as an intern with the program, frankly, my office window was literally right above the square that she's writing about. And I saw that progression. I would see every Friday that same exact group of men gathering to pray in a very wealthy district of Cairo. The reality is that Islamism, political Islam, Islamic conservatism, whatever term you want to use, is a complex movement. There is no one central organization or model that contemporary Islamists can really claim to follow. Iran's example has really gained very few followers and admirers, and very few people in the region believe that Saudi Arabia is a haven of the good life. But we can summarize some threads that many Arab Islamists share by explaining it as an effort for Muslim societies in the Middle East to reclaim what many of them perceive as a loss of their communal Islamic identity over the course of the last century. That can be represented by Prime Minister Erdogan's Justice and Development Party in Turkey, just sitting on the edge of the Arab world, which advocates for the renewal of traditional virtues, things such as social justice, Muslim solidarity, while at the same time maintaining commitment to secular governance. If you want to think of it as a split between mosque and state, that wouldn't be a bad thing. Commitment to rule of law and to a certain degree of pluralism. The new Nahda party in Tunisia, or the newly ruling Nahda party in Tunisia, I should say, so far has retained a certain commitment to some level of secular governance, perhaps closest to Turkey's model than that of a place like Saudi Arabia. Although there have been some troubling signs that more conservative members of Tunisian society have been trying to push the envelope in a different direction. And in fact, Islamism at the other end of the spectrum can go in a very different direction. The current model of this are the Salafis of Egypt. The word Salafi refers to a sort of originist, ultra-conservatism, a Puritanism among some Egyptian Muslims, very often inspired, in fact, by Saudi Wahhabism, a sort of idea that one really should go back to the 7th century to find a real model for society. They don't represent the majority of Muslims, and nor do they represent the majority of Islamists necessarily in Egypt or other parts of the Middle East. But they are there, and they do retain a certain amount of popularity in some circles. And they have presented a real challenge for newly emerging democratic movements in Egypt and elsewhere. It is the Salafi groups, many of whom have local preachers, many of whom are quite intolerant, scattered around the country. It is some of those preachers who have inspired mob attacks on churches. One example was in last May of 2011. Just such a mob attacked a church in the city of Seoul, the village of Seoul, just south of Cairo, burned down the local church. Thankfully, no one lost their lives in the process, but Christian property was deeply damaged and people were terrified. In October, there was yet another attack on a church down in the village of Merinab, close to Aswan. And that was a particularly poignant incident because this attack on a church building eventually culminated in what's come to be known as the Mascara Massacre, where Christians who were protesting this church burning were attacked by the governing military. 27 people lost their lives in that. Just within the last couple of weeks, when the Coptic Orthodox Patriarch Pope Shenouda III passed away, and the Coptic community was in mourning, one Salafi preacher who has a fairly significant online presence by the name of Wagdi Ghunaim declared that Pope Shenouda in fact died of syphilis and some other immorally tainted ailments, and obviously drew a tremendous amount of ire as a result. Now, the Salafis don't represent mainstream Egyptian society, but their party did gain somewhere around a quarter of the new Egyptian parliament, and that's a troubling reality. The truth is that in these different models, this different spectrum of Islamists functioning now in the Middle East, we really don't know what this new Islamism is really going to look like. Frankly, neither do they, because we don't really have a new model of what it means to have democratically elected Islamist parties running countries in the Arab world. We simply don't have a model of that. And so there is a period of time now where, as these Islamists are looking to have a stronger foothold in government, but at the same time desperately seeking legitimacy, not just from their own communities, but from the international community, there is perhaps a window of opportunity for Western countries and governments and populations to engage with them. And I'll come back to that point in just a few minutes. We are also faced with this question, which is entirely appropriate to discuss here at Gordon College, and that's the question of course, the Christian minorities and other religious minorities, which are many around the region. What does this mean for them, this new Islamist ascendance, this new period of political and social uncertainty? Now, of course, frankly, Christian minorities in the region shouldn't be our only consideration, our only point of attention. Muslim majorities, comprised of, as I said before, regular people with their homes, their families, their jobs sometimes, and other mundane concerns, are no less deserving of dignity, of liberty, of political freedom, of economic growth, of participation, and frankly, freedom from state brutality. But I suspect that here at Gordon, more than a few of you are particularly concerned about that present and future status of our Christian brothers and sisters in the Arab world. Some of you may be surprised that there are a significant number of Christians in the region. And for those of you who may fall into that category, let me say, believe it. There are many Middle Eastern Christians. To throw out a few statistics here, always a dangerous thing. In Egypt, roughly 10 to 12% of the population, or 8 to 10 million Christians call Egypt home. Lebanon, somewhere around 1.5 million people, roughly 40% of the Lebanese population are Christian. Syria, 10%, 2 million. Iraq, there were once 1.5 million Christians in the country, but thanks to a rather messy period between 2003 and 2010, and some awful targeted attacks of Islamic extremists against Iraqi Christians, that number has dropped to somewhere around 400,000, many of whom are internally displaced to other parts of Iraq, many of whom fled to Jordan and Syria. In Israel and the Palestinian territories, there are somewhere around 300,000 Palestinian Christians remaining, 2% of the Israeli population. I'm sorry, I've written down the wrong statistics for that, so I'll avoid breaking that out further. But there are now more Palestinian Christians here in the U.S. than there actually are in the land of Christ. That's a depressing thing. I'll mention very briefly something that I introduced in my chapel talk this morning. There are a few real challenges facing Christians. I've talked already about this rise of Islamic parties here in this age of revolt in the region. And more than anything, Middle Eastern Christians are worried. They're worried that these new Islamic parties may try to place greater restrictions on the lives of Christians. There are those in the Islamist movement that have said they're not going to mess with Christians, that they're going to treat them as full and equal citizenships and partners in their respective national projects. But there are also those among Islamist organizations who have called for greater restrictions on the building and maintaining of churches, of the ability of Christians and other non-Muslims to worship freely, to represent themselves in political life, in public life. There are those who have called for the reinstitution of poll taxes on non-Muslim men and all sorts of troubling things like that. Not to mention, of course, other concerns of things like the rights of women, which I will come back to a little bit later as well. And two other points that I mentioned this morning. One is the problem of emigration, that many Christians in this era of upheaval are simply looking to leave. That's a tremendously sad development. In a sense, it's a development that's been going on for decades. We found lots and lots of Christians from Egypt, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Iraq, from other places around the region, simply applying for visas, going to the United States, to Europe, to Australia, and other places, and simply giving up. And the Middle East will be a very sad place indeed if it loses its Christians. One other point that I mentioned in my chapel talk this morning, and I do want to spend a couple of minutes on, perhaps in a little bit greater detail, is the question of social upheaval. Historically, Christians and other religious minorities in the Middle East have suffered the most. They have been the most vulnerable at periods when there has been political upheaval, social instability. In other words, times when all of the region's communities and societies have been at risk, that Christian minorities have been at special risk. This is a historical trend that's gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years. In my historical work, I've often worked in the period surrounding the Crusades. And during that period, local Christians were very often associated with Frankish crusaders, accused of being potential collaborators, fifth columns in the presence of their local communities, to work together with the crusaders. That was very rarely the case, because of course Middle Eastern Christians are and have always been just that, Middle Eastern Christians, part of their communities, part of the fabric of their societies. And they have suffered even back then. In 1915, of course, the Armenians of Eastern Anatolia suffered tremendously when the quickly breaking apart Ottoman Empire decided to subdue what they perceived as a potential threat to their sovereignty from the Armenians, infused with a touch of religious bigotry for those Christians, and marched whole communities of Armenians to their death through the northern Syrian desert and through eastern Anatolia. 1.5 million Armenians lost their lives in that genocide. In 1933, a newly independent Iraq was faced with a period in which it had tremendous instability, that its monarchy had very little power. It had a very thin veneer of nationalism holding together some very disparate groups within the country. And when rumors spread to the monarchy that Christian Assyrians were perhaps setting up militias to carve out territory for themselves, that new and fragile Iraqi government sent its army up to subdue them, brought along some Kurdish tribes, and in the process killed somewhere around 3,000 Assyrian Christians in the process. Those two examples I mentioned because they prompted Raphael Lemkin in 1933 to propose to the League of Nations a new term for a new kind of violence, genocide. Now, I am not suggesting that the period that we are entering into in the Middle East right now is a period of genocide. That's not my intention, but it's simply to show what can happen when social and political upheaval wreak havoc with communities and countries. I am suggesting that Christians in the Middle East right now are facing a real period of uncertainty, a variety of risks from a variety of directions. So let me provide to you a few concluding thoughts. Is this an Arab Spring or an Islamist winter? Well, the answer, as very often is the case, is a little bit of both. We can and we should not detract from the quest for human dignity, for political freedom and political expression, for an end to the brutal and very corrupt regimes that have plagued the Middle East for generations now. To deny the Arab world this is to deny them their own dignities, and that cannot end well for anyone. But we must recognize a few things at the same time. Democracy is more than just holding elections. The region is, for many of its people, sorely lacking in an understanding and knowledge of democracy's ideological underpinnings. Things like individual conscience, religious liberty, the freedom of expression. Few communities in the Middle East, frankly, have had any sort of experience with these ideals. It doesn't mean that they can't espouse them. It doesn't mean that Muslims cannot have democracy. They can, but they haven't had any experience with it, at least not in the Middle Eastern context. In the short term, Islamists clearly will have their time in the limelight, and that is a reality we must face. It may be a kind of Islamist winter for some time to come. The question is, can the United States, the West, and others engage with them in meaningful ways? Ways that encourage those among them with moderate tendencies, and there are those among them, while isolating and excluding those with more radical views. As I quoted in chapel this morning, the real struggle in the years to come is not between Muslims and the West or others, but the real struggle is between Muslims and Muslims. They are, after all, the sizable majorities of communities of the Middle East, and they are as deserving of freedoms and rights as any other communities with which we as American Christians may have a separate affinity. And we can highlight and publicize those Muslim viewpoints that challenge those traditionalist assumptions. Just to give you one example, a An up-and-coming Turkish writer by the name of Mustafa Akil recently wrote a book, I think it came out in 2010, called Islam Without Extremes, discussing Islamic history and tradition, advocating for religious piety. And Mustafa is a practicing Muslim, but at the same time calling for secular governance. Again, a sort of separation between mosque and state. He advocates for freedom of conscience, including advocating for the ability of people to change their religion if they choose to convert from Islam to other religions. And that's, in many circles in the Muslim Middle East, that's a rather novel and very controversial topic, and yet he has been boldly writing and advocating for just such a perspective. There are those among the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, including among those who are still in the organization and some who have recently left the group, who have shown interest in their writings from time to time of a more progressive view of citizenship. And those ideas should be encouraged and drawn out. In my view, citizenship is the single most important concept for the future of non-Muslims in the region, because Christians and other religious minorities in the Middle East have long been discussed and governed as communities, not as individuals, but somehow set apart as other than the mainstream of other societies in the Middle East. And that cannot continue. In the long term, non-Muslim minorities, including but not limited to the region's Christians, need the spring side of this equation to succeed. There is no turning back the clock to 2 years ago, even for those who might wish it to be so. The short term may be winter, but I hold out hope, perhaps a slim hope, but hold on to it I must, that planting seeds of concepts like citizenship, of moderation, in this uncertain time is the only way to protect the future, to protect its communities, and to hope that that future may yet blossom.